the Existential Risk Alliance, or ERA, at Cambridge University. ERA aims to research how to mitigate existential risks or global catastrophic risks, which are events that could permanently and drastically curtail humanity's long-term potential, for example, through human extinction. And climate change is a focus area within the X-risk field, and more specifically SRM. And my project investigated the interplay between X-risk and SRM. So one could ask, how does SRM become relevant in X-risk? And the answer is termination shock, simply defined as a rapid and substantial rise in global temperatures following a cessation of SAI deployment. Following termination, there would be a buffer period of a minimum of several months, during which, if SAI is not redeployed, the impacts of termination shock would be felt. So if SAI were to be abruptly terminated, it's likely that atmospheric and oceanic carbon dioxide emissions would accumulate, and temperature rise would happen at a rate such that temperatures would rebound to what they would have reached had geoengineering not been deployed. And this abrupt spike in temperature would cause massive ecological damage, making adaptation almost impossible for life on Earth. It is often presented as one of the most severe risks associated with solar geoengineering, as its impacts would be catastrophic. So across the literature, two primary drivers of termination shock have been identified. The first, over on the left, is political instability, international conflict, and the collapse of a governing coalition. And the second driver, over on the right, is the occurrence of a global catastrophe that could either directly destroy SRM infrastructure and prevent redeployment within the buffer period, and secondly, the cascading impacts of the event could inhibit the political and/or economic capacity to maintain the SRM program. And although drivers of termination shock have been identified, SRM resilience measures to catastrophic events are lacking. That being said, and given that the effects of termination shock would be catastrophic, within the context of an SRM scenario, the study overall aimed to investigate if plausible pathways to termination shock from global catastrophic events exist and what these are. This was done to identify potential areas where mitigation measures could be established to firstly increase the resilience of SRM infrastructure to global catastrophic events, and secondly, to decrease the risk of termination shock from occurring. And this was done through a qualitative investigation of the pathways from 3 catastrophic events that could disrupt an SRM program for long enough to cause termination shock. The first is a solar superstorm, the second a volcanic eruption, and the third a global pandemic. And these 3 events were chosen because the nature of their interactions with SRM infrastructure are all quite different. And lastly, the study also contributes to existential risk literature with respect to double catastrophes. The figure shown here illustrates pathways from a global pandemic to termination shock, and from the interviews, a commonly identified first-order impact in this scenario is that politicians and governments could blame the pandemic on the SRM program, and this is referred to as the blame game. And this could in turn deepen existing rivalries and erode the minimal existing global cooperation. The blame game could also lay ground for regional war that could escalate into a large-scale war, and this could increase the possibility of SRM infrastructure. This includes SRM fleets and air bases of being collateral damage of the war, which could both stop SRM deployment as well as prevent it from restarting, causing termination shock. And another plausible pathway from regional war outbreak to termination shock is that as nations engage in warfare, people who are anti-SRM could intentionally destroy SRM infrastructure as they would now have access to weapons. So far from engaging with the qualitative data, I have identified the following common key points of vulnerability to catastrophic events, that being disruptions to global trade and supply chains, the blame game, economic strain from the catastrophic event, and finally, exacerbated geopolitical tensions, the risk of conflict, as well as conflict itself.